Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another episode of Jaywalks Tech Talk. Today we are going to be talking about suspension and more importantly, how we can make sure that your suspension is working as good as absolutely possible. And we're gonna be doing it for pretty much free as long as you've got some tools and some grease on hand. Now, I'd be willing to bet that 99% of you guys watching this video don't have your suspension quite perfectly installed on your motorcycle. And of course, that's leaving some performance benefits on the table. And I'm not just talking to the guys with the 30-year-old two-stroke out there. Even if you have a brand new 2024 factory edition 450, I'll be the first one to tell you these things do not come from the dealerships perfectly installed or even with an adequate amount of grease to have these things working properly and to bulletproof them for the long term. So even if you guys think you have a perfectly pristine bike, you are probably still leaving some performance on the table. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about how you guys can unlock that potential and get the absolute most out of your motorcycle. Now, I don't need to be the one to tell you, but we spend a lot of money on these machines, and there's probably some of you out there who drop a couple $1,000s on some A-kit suspension or at least a revalve and a respring. But not many people talk about the last crucial step with the installation of this stuff to make sure that it's actually working properly. And I'll go out on a limb and say that you guys would be better off with a properly aligned, greased, and torqued set of bone stock suspension than you would be with a misaligned, mistorqued, and misadjusted set of factory A-kit suspension. And after doing a little Google search, there's really not much information out there on the topic. So I figured with my knowledge as a professional racer and my own full-time mechanic, I would make a comprehensive guide on the topic and help you guys make sure that your bikes are working perfectly. And of course, there's gonna be some bikes out there that do just have extremely old suspension that maybe doesn't have any oil, maybe it's got some broken parts, and you guys will actually benefit from taking your bike to a reputable suspension company like TCD Racing, who I use and I recommend. But for the vast majority of you guys, just making sure that your stuff is properly lubricated, torqued, aligned, and adjusted. Those four things are the important ones, and that's what we're gonna be going over today. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So let's go ahead and start with the rear of the motorcycle, because the rear is much easier. There's a lot less things that you need to align properly, but it is a little bit more labor intensive because greasing the rear end of this machine is it's a little bit of a process. I'm not gonna run through step by step how to take your linkage apart and your swing arm off and grease all of the linkage bearings and all that, because that would be its own 15-minute video, and I'm super down to make a video on that if you guys are interested in seeing exactly how to do that. There are some videos out there, and I've actually done it in a couple videos as well. So I'll link those down below, and I'll also put some video up on the screen of me doing that right now. But even if you have a brand new bike, these things come from the factory with just the tiniest little layer of grease on them, and they're gonna work fine in that state, but they're not gonna last very long. So I always recommend this thick blue Maxima grease. I see it in every single professional mechanic shop that I go to, so I'm not sponsored by them. This is just how I feel. I think it's the best of the best. If you guys are gonna be doing this job, just pick yourself up some of that stuff. Pack it in there really good. I would repack it every 10 to 15 hours if you want to avoid having to change bearings. If you keep these things greased up really well, they will last forever. But if you're taking apart an old bike, they might be pretty crusty in there, and you might have to redo some of the bearings. It's just part of the game. But once you replace the bearings, if you take care of them, they will last you the entire time that you have your motorcycle. So this part is super important. Once you have your linkage bearings greased and it's time to put everything back together, go ahead and just thread all the nuts on for the linkage and the shock by hand, and don't do them up. There's not really any aligning that you have to do, but a big mistake that a lot of people make is tightening and torquing the bolts down with the bike on the stand and no weight on the rear wheel. And that can cause a lot of binding in the rear end once you actually set the bike on the ground. So make sure you take your bike off the stand when you go to torque these bolts. Ideally, you'll have someone sitting on it while another person torques the bolts, but I kind of just drape over the side and put a little weight on the seat while I torque these down. And you want to make sure that you torque the bolts that are connected to the chassis first. So on the linkage, that's the pivot that goes through the swing arm, and then for the linkage arms, it's the one that goes through the frame itself. It's hard to get an actual torque wrench on these. You can get like a wrench tip for a torque wrench. I don't have one, so you kind of just have to guess with an open end wrench. After those, you move on to the shock bolt at the top where it bolts into the chassis, and then finally the one below where the shock bolts into the linkage. Applying some pressure onto the seat the whole time so that the linkage and everything is all settled in place. The biggest difference I notice when I tighten it on the stand versus off the stand is that the rebound is way faster and just a lot more free feeling when you have weight on the motorcycle when you torque it all down. Realistically, while you're riding, you probably put enough forces through this that it will settle itself eventually, but it just feels better knowing that you did it the right way. Once you have everything greased and torqued down, it is time to set your sag. And this is going to be different for each motorcycle. For the KTM, I tend to like to run around like 103 or 104. This Motion Pro sag tool is super useful. It has the adjustable bottom like plumb that you put in the rear axle, and then you make a mark on the rear fender. You put it at 0, and then when you're sitting on the bike, however far down the rear fender goes is how much it's sagging. You don't have to do any math. So highly recommend this sag tool. And I also recommend doing sag while standing with no hands on the handlebar. This is controversial, but in my opinion, this is the only way to accurately and consistently get the same reading. If you try and take sag while you're sitting on the seat, it can drastically change just depending on if you sit a couple inches forward or a couple inches backwards, and it's really hard to get the same reading over and over again. As you can see, here I'm on the front of the seat, here I'm on the back, and the difference is huge. If you're standing straight up and down on the pegs and you're not holding on to handlebars or anything that you can pivot your weight on, if you lean your chest way forward, your butt sticks out backwards to counterbalance and the sag remains the same. Same if you lean a little bit far backwards, the sag will remain the same no matter what. So in my opinion, standing is the only right way to set sag, and you will constantly see the pro guys setting sag like this. So checkmate, that's the right way to do it. So as we can see, not too much going on with the rear of the motorcycle. As long as you have things greased up and torqued in the right order with a little bit of pressure on that rear end, you're pretty much gonna be all right. And then of course, getting a good sag reading. And at the end of the day, the sag number isn't as important as the consistency of the sag. It doesn't necessarily matter whether you like 102 versus 105 better. What matters is that if you like 102, you can make it 102 every single time. But now let's move on to the front of the bike where things get a little bit more tricky. We obviously have 2 independent fork legs. We have the front axle, triple clamps, handlebars, all sorts of stuff in there that we need to make sure is aligned perfectly. And once you know the correct order to do things in, it's not very difficult. It's just kind of difficult to visualize it at first and figure out what order you need to go in, but luckily I've done all that for you and I will run you guys through the steps. The front end is definitely more important than the rear end in my opinion. All of your weight is above the rear shock, so even if it's really crusty and not greased well, the rear shock is still gonna work pretty well because all of your weight's on top of it, so you have a lot of force going into that rear shock. The forks on the other hand don't have quite as much weight going on them, so they have to be sensitive to a much lighter input of force on them. But at the same time, your forks normally land first on a big impact, so they also have to be very stiff in order to account for something like that. One of the biggest things that people come up to me at the track is they go, hey, my forks just feel super harsh through the little choppy stuff, but they keep blowing through and bottoming out on jump faces and landings. And to me, that is a dead giveaway right off the bat that their forks are not aligned properly. And what's happening is because they're not aligned, it's creating a bunch of friction in the forks and creating what I like to call a crust. It's almost like if you have some crunchy snow, you can walk across the top of it if you're really careful, but if you put enough pressure, you break through that crust into the soft undersnow. And it's kind of like the forks. You have so much friction caused by the misalignment that at first they feel harsh and you feel like you have to put a lot of pressure in them to get them to move. But then finally, once you put enough pressure to break through the friction and you go into the valving, it's really soft. And that's kind of what you're feeling. A lot of people will feel it really harsh and choppy, like coming into a corner that's really choppy because their forks literally might not be moving. Those little inputs of the chop aren't enough to break through the crust. And so they go back to their van, get out the trusty flat blade, and they start softening the valving, which actually doesn't help with that friction at all. It doesn't make it feel any better on that little chop. But what happens is then when you start hitting jump faces, you're just blowing through. And you're like, what the heck? Is my stuff stiff or is it soft? And I think it's a big reason why people are afraid to go with a stiffer suspension setup, even if that's what they really need. But sometimes people will ride my bike and they're like, dude, I thought your suspension was gonna be stiffer. And I'm like, well, my suspension is way stiffer. It's just not binding. So it feels nice and soft and supple on that little chatter coming into the corners. But you'll notice I never bottom my forks out. Even when I'm wide open fourth gear into the face of a really abrupt jump, or if I overshoot something or just jump into flat, I don't bottom out, even though it feels softer on the parts of the track where you want it to feel soft. Another way that you can tell if the front end's misaligned is just by the stickiness of the forks when you're just sitting there on your bike. 90% of the time when we go to check somebody's sag, you can lift up on the front end and it'll settle like 2 inches higher than if you press down on the front end and let it come up to its natural sitting spot. There could be like 3-4 inches discrepancy between settling down and settling up. And that's just due to the fork friction caused by a misalignment. That's the first thing people notice when they sit on my bikes. They're like, dude, how are your forks so soft? Like, you can barely just breathe on the bar pad and the forks will go up and down because it's just so smooth. And whether I pull up on my forks and let them settle or push down on the forks and let them rise to settle, they'll stop in almost the exact same spot, if not like maybe half an inch out of place. And part of that comes to having a good company do your suspension like TCD, but a much bigger factor is just aligning your forks correct. So I'll stop talking and I'll run you guys through the steps. First step is going to be to remove and clean every single bolt so that you can re-grease it with a little bit of anti-seize so that you can get some accurate torque specs. But of course you can't take all the bolts out at the same time. So we're just going to take out the very lower pinch bolt on both sides of the triple clamp, clean those, and then snug them back in so that we can go ahead and remove all the other bolts to clean without the forks falling out on the floor. As you can see, my preferred method of cleaning the bolts is just a little bit of Scotch-Brite wrapped around the threads and then use an impact wrench to drive the bolt in and out just to get the threads really clean of any old grease, dirt, Loctite, whatever might have been on there. Then just a little bit of anti-seize on the threads and on the back of the head of the bolt on the area that's going to be making contact with the triple clamp, just so that when you're torquing this down, that lowers the friction and you'll get an accurate torque spec. With those two bolts back installed, you are free to remove every other bolt in the triple clamp, including the steering stem pinch bolts and top lock nut. You're going to want to leave the lock nut still on so that your triple clamp doesn't fall through, but you can loosen that up, as well as the 4 fork lug axle pinch bolts in the bottom. We're going to be cleaning, greasing, and torquing those as well, and then you can go ahead and remove the front wheel as well. Now that we got everything lined up, it is time to just go into a cleaning frenzy. It's very, very important to just get this stuff ultra clean so that you can torque it perfectly. Arguably the most critical part of aligning your front end is making sure that your front axle is insanely clean, smooth, and polished. This little lip on the non-brake side of the axle is where your right fork leg is going to be aligning itself. So you have to make sure that both the axle is super polished and clean here. So I take a little bit of Scotch-Brite and get it as clean as possible. And then of course we break out the legendary Mother's aluminum polish and go to town on this thing. Really doesn't require a whole lot of effort to get a perfectly mirror finish. So just put a little time in, get it super smooth, because this is a very crucial part of the process. And as I said, we're going to go ahead and do the same to the non-brake side fork lug hole. You can roll up the Scotch-Brite, get it in there, and then take a little bit of that aluminum polish and make sure it is absolutely beautiful. And then you can go ahead and take the axle and make sure that it goes in freely. There might be a little bit of friction, that's okay, but as long as it moves pretty freely in there and you can twist it around, that should be plenty good. But you definitely don't want any corrosion or metal burrs or anything that's going to create friction in there. Now that it's all clean, it's time to install a little bit more anti-seize on the threads and underneath the bolt heads of every single bolt here. The only bolt that gets Loctite is the one that pinches the steering stem. This one cannot come out or come loose because that can cause your steering stem to crack. So anti-seize on every bolt, Loctite on the steering stem pinch bolt, and then a little bit of assembly lube on the axle just to make sure that it doesn't corrode and to help us slide around in that fork leg like I was saying. The sweet sound of clean, well lubricated bolts going into a clean thread. You love to hear it. Now moving on to the fork alignment, there's a bunch of steps here that you have to do in the right order. And steps 1 and 2 are inserting the fork tubes and tightening the lower pinch bolts. And when I say tighten, I just mean barely snug. Of course, we already did that. So step 3 is to snug the steering stem cap. This essentially squeezes the top and the bottom triple clamp on the head tube of your frame. So it's important to get these squished down before you go ahead and try to set your fork height, because obviously if you set your fork height and then squish these together, your fork height is going to change. So you don't have to get them super tight, but just pretty snug. Step 4 is to go ahead and set your fork height. So just loosen that one pinch bolt on either side and try and get each fork leg the exact same height. That's going to be like the first important step for aligning your fork. And then just go ahead and snug that very bottom pinch bolt to lock those forks in place. If your forks are at different heights, obviously your axle is going to bind a little bit from one fork leg to the other. Then you go ahead and install your front wheel, and this is the part where things get tricky and easily the most important step in aligning your front end. So when you tighten your axle nut, it pulls your axle all the way through both fork legs and the hub of your wheel, and it bottoms out on the brake side of your bike. You have to pinch the axle so that it doesn't spin, but you can't pinch it on the brake side because then the axle won't pull through the brake side lug. So you have to tighten the non-brake side pinch bolts in order to tighten your axle nut down. That'll ensure that your axle goes all the way through the brake side lug and bottoms out on the nut, and that will ensure that your axle is perfectly perpendicular to your brake side fork leg. And now here's the tough part, aligning your right fork leg on that little lip of the axle that we talked about earlier to make sure that it is perfectly perpendicular to your axle and perfectly parallel to your other fork leg. There's a couple different ways to get the job done here. The most popular, but in my opinion the less preferred method, is to tighten the brake side pinch bolts and re-loosen the non-brake side pinch bolts. That's necessary so that the lug can slide on that lip. Then go ahead, pull the front brake in and push down on the front end to get the forks moving up and down. The thought process here is that while the forks are moving up and down, they'll naturally cause that fork lug to center on the lip on the axle. This appears to be the most common way to do it. In my opinion, it's a little bit of a brute way to do it and doesn't necessarily make things perfect every single time. Of course, once you pump it a few times, you would then tighten down the pinch bolts on this side. The way I prefer to do it, and I think is the better way to do it, is once you get your axle nut tight, you can loosen all of your pinch bolts and you can still get a wrench on your axle nut and spin the entire axle. By spinning it in a clockwise direction, it's not actually going to tighten the nut anymore. It's just going to cause the whole axle to spin inside of the fork lugs. And you can see here, the only way the axle is going to spin is if your fork legs are perfectly aligned. So you can take that right side fork leg and move it far to the inside on that lip or far to the outside, and no matter what, when you go ahead and spin the axle inside the fork lug, it's going to automatically center that fork leg. So in my opinion, this is a much more consistent way to do it. You can see whether I push it inward or pull it outward, it settles in the same exact spot, and that tells me that that is perfectly aligned. So that's the tricky part. Once you have that out of the way, you can go ahead and torque all of those axle pinch bolts to 15 Newton meters, at least that's on my bike, and then you can go ahead and torque the bottom pinch bolts of the triple clamp to 12 Newton meters. Of course, check out your manual to figure out your torque specs for your bike. And then we snugged down the top cap earlier, but now it's time to actually set the desired tension on it. And there's not a magic number here, it's more so just based on feel. The more you tighten down that top cap, the stiffer it's going to make your steering. So if you want kind of the poor man steering stabilizer, you can really crank down on this nut up on the top. I like mine to be fairly stiff. I don't want my handlebars flopping side to side. I like some resistance so that I kind of have to tap the handlebars a few times to get it all the way over to the stop. So ultimately, personal preference here, just figure out what you like. The top triple clamp bolts have to be loose here so that the triple clamps can actually squeeze the head tube like I was talking about earlier. If you have all of the bolts tight, this is not going to do anything. It's just going to tighten the nut on the top of your triple clamp. Once you have that set, torque the top triple clamp bolts. Mine are 17 Newton meters. Yours could be different. And then the very final step is to install and torque the steering stem pinch bolt. I think this is exclusive to Austrian bikes. If you have a Jap bike, you might not have this bolt, so good for you. But if you have Austrian, this bolt's super critical to get right. All right, so there you have it, guys. A comprehensive guide on how to perfectly clean, grease, torque, align, and adjust your suspension to make sure that it's working absolutely perfectly. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and I hope it helps you out. I really like being able to use the knowledge that I have built up over the last 20 years of racing dirt bikes and 10 years of racing professionally and help translate that into your guys' lives. So you'll have to comment down below and let me know if this was useful to you. I feel like this is some knowledge that not a lot of people know about, and it can make a huge difference on the way your bike performs. So I definitely want to make more content like this. So if there are some similar style videos that you guys have always been wondering about, definitely let me know down in the comments below and I'll do my best to hit those topics. Can't promise I know everything, but there is a lot that I've learned, and a lot of it is stuff that I don't even realize isn't common knowledge. So if there's something that you guys are dying to know, drop them down in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. But yeah, that's gonna do it for me. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll catch you in the next one. Peace out. So I'm gonna like sit forward, and then I'm gonna sit way back. Did that change a shit ton? Yeah, it changed a lot. All right, cool. That's what I'm trying to show by doing standing versus sitting.